Welcome back, everyone. After a quick break, it's now time for a temperature check on the UK as a market for AI startup and scale-ups. And we really want to kind of get a sense today of like how the UK is performing when it comes to talent, infrastructure, investment, and how we sort of set up the ecosystem for success. In the UK, the Startup Coalition very much provides a voice to the startup and scale-up ecosystem, and they've gathered a brilliant panel for us today to sort of talk about all of those kind of things that we sort of need to do to create that enabling environment for AI startups and scale-ups. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Vinous and introduce the panel and enjoy.
Brilliant, thank you so much. It is great to be here. I've just been saying, it's so impressive that despite the fact that Paris is on our doorstep, the Milltown team have, managed to throw together such a stellar cast. And I'm joined by, a really sort of top tier group of people to talk about how the UK can best sort of compete on the global stage. My name is Vinous Ali. I'm Deputy Executive Director at Startup Coalition. I will say a few words about us, and then I'm going to hand over to my panelists in turn to introduce themselves so that they don't have to listen to their bios butchered. So the Startup Coalition, we are the policy voice for startups and scale-ups here in the United Kingdom. We have over 4,000 startup founders, policy wonks, investors, etc. in our ecosystem. And our only mission is to make the UK's policy environment one where the UK startups can succeed. So I'm going to go to Michael first, just to say a few words about yourself and Ada, and then we'll just take it down the stream before we get into the crux of the debate.
Super. Thank you so much, Vinous. So I'm Michael Tefula. I'm a principal and head of product at Ada Ventures. Ada Ventures is an inclusive venture capital fund based here in London, investing at pre-seed across three broad investment areas: climate, healthcare, and economic empowerment. So my job title is a little bit weird because actually, even though I spend 80% of my time investing in pre-seed stage companies, I spend about 20% of my time building technology products within the firm, automating a number of different workflows that we have within the venture firm, but also actually building external-facing products for founders. So one of the things we launched in November last year is a product called Ada GPT, a play on the GPT product that everyone knows. But this is a tool that founders can sort of use to get feedback, rapid feedback on their pitch decks before they send those pitch decks to us. So we are primarily a venture capital fund, but we're looking to do venture capital very, very differently. I'll pass over the mic.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be here. Who wants to be in Paris anyway? My name's Daniel Quirke, so I'm the Public Policy Manager at Wayve. So Wayve is a UK-based company. We were founded in 2017 and to date have raised just short of $1.3 billion. And we're basically building physical AI that empowers sort of driving assistance and automation technologies. We have a fleet of test vehicles based here in London, which we test every day in and around kind of the city. And we've also recently expanded operations to the US, so a site in California and also a new hub in Vancouver where we're building out a science team. And ultimately, we're building foundation models that you can place onto any base vehicle. And it's a data-learned approach, which means it's not bound by hand-coded rules, it's not reliant on HD maps, which from our perspective gives a really scalable way of solving the self-driving problem. We're focused at the moment on working with fleet operators and car manufacturers who ultimately we would license our software to place on their vehicles, and that would kind of enter the market at a high level of assistance features. So, what you see in consumer vehicles today are kind of advanced assistance features that help the driver with the driving task. That's our entry point, and the plan then is to move through high levels of automation to fully self-driving. So that's Wayve.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Rish, Mitra. I'm co-founder of a company called Greyparrot. I've been in the field of computer vision-based AI for the last 16 years. In my previous business called Blipper, we built the world's first visual search engine and was mapping the whole consumption world and what people look at in a world perfectly. While building that, we realized that waste is a huge problem, and one of the reasons 92% of world's recyclables do not get recycled because there's no digitization and you cannot solve a problem you can't measure. So we founded Greyparrot to build a waste intelligence platform where we're mapping the post-consumption world, where we're putting our equipment in major material recovery facilities. So companies like Veolia and Suez in Europe, and BIFA and Waste Management Inc. in US. And last year we diverted 150,000 tons of recyclable materials back into the community just as a factor of Greyparrot. But we've got a long way to go. And in terms of scale, we are in par with most social networks in the world. You may find it hard to believe, but we processed 479 billion images last year, and that number would scale up to a few trillions this year because people throw a lot of stuff in the bin rather than posting stuff on Instagram. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Sam Hields. I'm a partner at OpenOcean, which is a Finnish/London-based VC fund. We focus at seed and A, so slightly after you. Probably most well known as the fund that was created by the founders of MySQL and MariaDB. So we come from we're all former engineers. I'm a former engineer. So we tend to focus on data, which of course bubbles up nicely into the world of AI, of course. Personal background. Was a software engineer, perhaps most infamously worked 10 years ago at Uber when it was launching in the UK, and did a lot of the city launches around the UK, which was a lot of fun. But yeah, I've been a venture capitalist now for sort of 6 years, so that's now my longest stint.
Brilliant. So I'm going to start off with trying to sort of set the tone for the conversation. Obviously, every country is making a big bet on artificial intelligence. We've seen sort of Macron leading the charge across in Paris yesterday with sort of a sort of stake in the ground, if you will, with billions of dollars of investment. The UK, by contrast, is a fairly sort of small player on the global stage, and yet we have brilliant founders still setting up their businesses here. We have a diverse and thriving investor community. So what is the UK sort of unique selling point? And Rish, perhaps I can start with you, because you created Blipper, you went and scaled in the US, and now with your sort of with Greyparrot, you're starting back here in the UK again. So you've seen both sides and chosen the UK for home again. So yeah, perhaps I can start with you.
I mean, there was a cultural element, though. Blipper was a very demanding scale-based business, and it was significantly more than a decade ahead of time. So we would pick talent anywhere we would find it, and we were fairly a global company, and Silicon Valley was the right place to scale it. But still, I believe even in Blipper, the first generation of primary research came from talent from the team in the UK. For us, hiring from my co-founder was from Imperial, and he wrote the initial code, and generally from Cambridge and Oxford and other major universities. And then there was an element of mindset or achieving the impossible or solving a very hard thing, which was a combination of investors and the market accepting it, and that was one of the factors that drove us to the US. But when again I restarted another AI company, and with Greyparrot, it feels like always like the right place to start because of not just the knowledge infrastructure and the R&D, but certain level of, initially a company needs a certain level of humility and groundedness, which culturally is present within the UK, because you don't want the hype and the cost to get inflated before you've produced your first prototype, because you have to build something and then eventually sell it to the market in terms of product market fit and investors. And I feel UK is still very well poised to initially incubate a business from talent, and also London is a planet in a plate, for you. So it's a great place to start business, to trial new ideas.
I adore that. London is a planet on a plate. I'm going to have to remember that and recycle it somewhere else. Daniel, I mean, Wayve is a UK-based company, and you're now sort of making your first sort of tentative steps in the US as well. What are sort of the main differences you see between the sort of UK ecosystem and the US ecosystem, and why do you think the UK still has such a powerful part to play even in this global competition?
Yeah, I mean, again, our founder story is, we're kind of a spin out from Cambridge University. So Alex Kendall, our CEO and founder, was studying his PhD at Cambridge in computer vision, and that kind of grew into what Wayve is today. I think there's many features about kind of the UK in the context of building AI for self-driving that makes it a good place to be developing from an early stage. I mean, we've also got to remember Wayve kind of came to the problem of self-driving a lot later than the industry had already started trying to solve this problem. I mean, it's, we're kind of 20 years in and, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment already trying to solve this problem, and it's still not yet a commercially viable solution. And that means also that, not only did Alex bring a technical approach and a thesis to this, which kind of saw the potential of machine learning, as the answer to solve self-driving, but it also meant there was lots of years of investment and learning from the US that, meant that Wayve could think about this differently and do things differently. And I think one of the benefits of being in the UK versus the US actually is when we're starting to think about cracking this problem and thinking about the scalable kind of market that's available for this technology, it's much larger than just the US, right? It's a lot larger than just North American automakers. Our route to market is getting our product licensed into base vehicles across car manufacturers. And actually, if you think about the automakers in Europe and in Asia, many of which are actually in type approval markets, which is a very particular type of regulation to bring a system and a vehicle to market, that does not exist in the US. So actually what you've got here is a regulatory moat, actually, in many respects, that you need to crack. But it's also an opportunity to bring frontier AI into the real world through a regulatory framework in a way that no one else has done so yet. And that gives European automakers, automakers in Japan, an opportunity to compete with some of the tech development in the US that they haven't seen to date yet, because no one yet has been able to type approve and bring through basically an AI model through a certification process. And that's the real opportunity for Wayve in the UK as well, right? Because we can anchor our investment and development here, but ultimately, we're building for global scale. We're building for global OEMs. The US is a nice way of, showing how our model that has been trained and built in London can now start to generalize and prove how it can apply itself to US roads. One of the key theses of our development is you build one driving model that has the power and the intelligence without extra training and hand coding and mapping to apply that intelligence to unknown, unseen roads. So, the models from London are the models that are now driving in California and San Francisco. And yes, it helps also that a lot of investors are in California. So there's a talent base there that we can leverage, and it also helps us open up opportunities to the North American market as well. So I think there's different reasons why the UK, the US are important, but we very much see ourselves as a UK-based company. It will be our anchorage, but we will make no apologies about seeking out global scale, because that's what our product ultimately is being built for, and that is how we will show a return on investment and commercialise, and that requires international expansion.
And I think, that's always going to be true for the UK and for UK founders, is that actually, the EU will have a home market of 500 million now. We can talk about sort of the fact that it's fragmented and across a number of different cultures and languages, but we just don't have that. And so our founders from day dot have to be thinking internationally about how they want to sort of scale. But as sort of investors at that sort of, seed A level, what are you saying to sort of your sort of investments in terms of when they're looking to the US? Are you trying to keep them here? Is it natural that they're eventually going to go to the US? What does that conversation look like?
So I think, as Dan was mentioning earlier, international markets are really important. The UK, we definitely punch above our weight in a lot of different ways, but it is a limited market. So all the companies that we invest in, from an investor perspective, we're always thinking, actually, is there a global market for the product that you're building, or are you just building for the UK? So with a lot of businesses that we invest in, whether they are at pre-seed or they're advancing through to later stages, there's always a international story. And typically that tends to be the US, to your point about, Europe having 500 million people, but you've got different languages, you've got different bits of regulation, especially now with Brexit, where we've got a different regulatory regime in the UK versus the rest of Europe. But yeah, I mean, we're always looking for an international story, and I'm sure, Sam, you would also probably agree.
Yeah, we're not opposed to them moving over to the US. Sometimes the US investors want them to flip to become a US topco because they're just easier for them to wrap their head around it. And actually, the reality is like a lot of the growth capital is in the US, so we're pretty well serviced from a pre-seed, seed, and A stage. But generally, there comes at a certain point where you just, the depth of the capital market over there is just much deeper. I think the other thing, though, that perhaps isn't captured in the 500 million, it doesn't really relate like that, right? So it's not the 500 million people aren't the consumers for most of what VCs invested, so it's actually businesses, and the vast majority of big businesses are in America. We actually did this analysis in our portfolio some years ago, and it was well over half of the revenue in the portfolio was coming from the US, even though we only invest in initially European startups. So I think there is still that, and it's more of an economic pull rather than a number of people pull. If it was number of people, they'd all be in China, but that's obviously not where they are. So yeah, it's just an economic pull, and I think the language plays a big role in it as well. Obviously, you have everybody speaks English in America, and it's fairly homogenous culturally, and that's very different. People buy things much quicker in America. We had a cybersecurity investment, or do have a cybersecurity investment. I can tell you the Americans will pick up the phone and adopt stuff much faster than Europeans will. So it just tends to be also that the buyers just come from the US, and it's funny because a lot of European or UK VCs, one of the things they might pitch a startup is we'll help you get your go-to-market team built up in the US. That's like a very common thing that they'll say, and then funny, if you go speak to some of the US funds on the West Coast, one of the things they say is, "Oh, we'll help you build your engineering team in Europe," which is cheaper and just as good, arguably. So it depends also on your perspective where you are. So.
And just to expand on that point about talent, I think Rish mentioned sort of talent earlier, and this is one of the reasons from an investment perspective, we're super excited about the UK. I mean, the UK has, I was looking at the numbers a couple of weeks ago, about a fifth of AI engineering talent across Europe. There's about 20,000 AI engineers in London, right? That's more than 2x anything else in any other sort of European city. So from a talent perspective, we're excited about investing in the UK because there's a ton of AI engineering talent, but actually it's also cheaper than the US, which is an advantage for companies having their offices here.
And that ecosystem is a puzzle, right? It's that sort of talent piece, and it's the sort of capital piece, but also the adoption piece. And I mean, the government has sort of repivoted towards going for growth. You've seen announcements recently on the Oxford-Cambridge corridor and the recreation of sort of East-West Rail. The AI Opportunity Action Plan is obviously incredibly ambitious, etc. Is there one thing that the government could do to sort of move the dial and ensure that the UK remains sort of in the race, if not world leading? Or is it enough that actually the government sounds upbeat, sounds open, both from an investor perspective but also from sort of from a founder's perspective? Michael, I'll throw it open to you first.
Yes, I'm not sure there's a magic bullet, but we've been looking at this, and I think so. The UK has the highest industrial electricity costs across, I think, like 28 countries that the IEA looked at. It's really expensive. It's 4 times more expensive than the US. I think it's about 1.5 times more expensive than France. That's a big challenge for data centers, right? So if you think about these foundational models, and you think about having massive GPU clusters, can we afford, can corporates afford the energy costs that come with that? So I think there's a lot of work to do on the energy side, and I'm not sure. I mean, there's talk about things like zonal pricing and having cheaper electricity in certain parts of the UK. I'm not sure we have a solution for it yet, but it's going to be a big part of fixing this sort of AI energy problem.
You've got Trump saying, what, drill, baby, drill. You've got Macron's plug, baby, plug. So the challenge to anyone in the room is what is the UK's version of that perhaps is less cringy. Rish, how about for you?
I can give a twofold answer. First, on the point of energy, sometimes when you have a disadvantage, in the long run, it does become your advantage. So I'm predicting in a 10, 15-year cycle, we'll see models that are coming out of places where there's certain disadvantage like costs or less access to GPUs. we will see a lot more efficiency play. Sometimes surplus creates bad habits. And increasingly, and we can address, because I have a tendency to digress, that how this landscape would lay out, we'll see, and we should talk about it, because sometimes there's a lot of overemphasis on the current hype of generative AI and what it really means. But I feel the UK has some really good fundamental ingredients at play, which is driven by research, which is driven by, it's weird to say, but actually scarcity. Because there's scarcity of GPUs, there's costs are high, and I don't think the government is fully understanding everything's going on, and there is not enough incentives. Because if the incentives was there, the government would subsidize GPUs. That's just the foundational piece of growth in the AI era. The government would encourage build and buy in UK. There's no favoritism, So in fact, many companies and majority of government tenders are non-UK companies winning. So there is no domestic favoritism, and which is not a bad. I'm not saying whether it's a good or a bad thing, because there's incredible talent and output in UK, but when tenders are open, it's always opened, usually wide. So I think there are 2-3 areas government could look at to harness competitive advantage, retain it, and really showcase it, where sometimes in the name of so wide fairness that it becomes a bit almost unfair to the domestic founders.
And we'll see where the sort of sovereign UK AI piece of work goes. That sort of like number 10 and Matt Clifford is spinning up. Sam, in your sort of spare time, which I'm sure you have tons of, you're obviously doing lots in the region, particularly in York. Do you feel like the government should put its sort of thumb on the scale a little bit to rebalance things? Yep. We've talked a lot about London specifically, but the UK is far bigger than London.
Yeah, well, it is interesting. So I've done some analysis on this, and it's I think it's basically, depends how you cut it up, but it's about 90% of all venture money goes to Oxford, London and Cambridge, and the vast majority actually goes to London. So Oxford and Cambridge are a distant second and third, and I think Bristol's an even much more like Pluto-type distance in fourth, and then Manchester and what have you. So probably something should be done. It depends on some people believe you should just go all in on London, and everyone who's brilliant should just go to London. And that there is an argument for that, because a lot of it's around clustering and networking. I think it's a bit of a depressing story that we should just gut everywhere in the country to do that. So probably there is something to be done. They already do put their thumb on the scale a little bit with the regional funds, as we were discussing. So the regional investment funds and the NPIF and the Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund, and they've just done the second one of that. But if you look at it, it's really just a story of migration. So if you look at the American figures of all the unicorns in America, the vast majority are not American people. Actually, I think Britain is like the third largest demographic of unicorn founders in the US. So it's all kind of like Russian dolls. You lose great people, say in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, North England, whatever. They come to London, but then also like a good number of these people go to America. And so it all kind of like, it's like a stream. So I've always thought probably the only really good way of doing it is to make sure that people can start companies. Because lots of people do want to, it's just they look around and don't see anything. No one looks like them, right? No one's starting up. It feels very isolated. So I'm not sure if it's for government necessarily, but I think it's no bad thing to make some capital readily available, provided it doesn't lead to some sort of perverse allocation, because that's the other thing, right? That if you just give out money to like subpar managers or even subpar startups, you don't really do anything. You just make the number go up. So I think it's really tricky to solve it. Yeah. But I think one part of it is, you just do more grassroots things, and hopefully you can hit some sort of critical mass that at some point drives itself. But I don't really know the definitive answer for it. But yeah. And
I mean, we have good universities everywhere. So like, Manchester, you can look at Edinburgh, Durham, etc. So do you think that the sort of the grassroots at the heart of it is probably, using those universities as the sort of...
Yeah, and I can comment on that very quickly. So yes, Edinburgh does quite well. They have a good ecosystem as well, so they have old college capital, and they have their own endowment, and they can do quite a lot. And they have the benefit of founders that have done well, like Skyscanner, active in the region. Most places don't have that. Actually, York has a company called Anaplan that was started there, which became very big and has a legacy of really great jobs in the city, and the founder is still there. So actually, quite a rare case. But the problem with the universities, and I don't know if anyone's from the universities here, but the problem is they just have like a kind of myopic view on like how they should do things. They kind of refuse to accept that, what's the best university for spin-outs in Europe? I would argue it's ETH Zurich. ETH Zurich takes nothing. So why should a university take 50% of a startup that hasn't even got revenue yet? They refuse to accept this. The really good thing is actually, just to take York Angels as an example, we're noticing that people are bypassing the universities and coming directly to us to get funding. This leads to some complications, of course, because their claim is not necessarily just investment terms. It's because you've used our facilities or whatever. But I think perhaps founders are getting a bit savvy to how they can bypass the universities, which is probably not the optimal solution. The optimal solution is to look more like ETH Zurich, but maybe they will do that if they're losing the best to other facilities of getting cash. So yeah, it's pretty complex, but I think there's been a whole consultation on this around trying to unify it a bit.
Yeah, and I think, so we're very closely engaged with the sort of the spin-out review, etc., and we're looking to do a piece of work in this space. So, anyone who is interested in talking about sort of universities and spin-outs, please find myself or Keir afterwards. We'd be very happy to talk to you. But Daniel, going back to that point of sort of, what can government do to help ensure that the UK sort of stays ahead of the curve? Is it just about sort of, sounding upbeat and being positive, or other sort of tangible things, whether that's from Wayve's perspective or sort of what you see in the ecosystem that the government can do to sort of turbocharge things?
Yeah, I think we definitely need to see things rather than just sound bites. Generally, I would say the UK, from our perspective, has taken a really good track from kind of a regulatory perspective with AI. The sector kind of based approach that they kind of took in the previous white paper, for us, kind of is a sensible way of thinking about AI based risk in context. So in terms of what Wayve's building and kind of wider embodied AI, it's ultimately going to be deployed in highly regulated, safety critical applications. We're going to have existing regulators who are already thinking about these types of systems or products, in the context of their market, and they are the best point and place to start thinking about what is the impact of an AI-based solution in that particular setup. So I think that's always been a very sensible, pragmatic approach from our perspective, and also kind of gives us the right guardrails, I think, to bring a product to market. I think where we've heard some announcements recently about a regulatory innovation office. You mentioned the sovereign AI unit. All of these things sound like the right thing. The reality is we haven't seen enough yet to know what that actually will mean in practice. I think one of the way we think about it a little bit is ultimately you're building something that's going to be disruptive, right? It's an AI-based product. It's probably going to be disruptive to a traditional market model. It's probably also going to end up kind of being released in some kind of regulated market. For that, you don't just need kind of sensible approaches to regulation. You need a vision, and you need kind of an approach and a risk appetite to how you want to design regulation for a particular kind of country. And I think what we need to see in the UK government is more of that, commercially minded growth mindset kind of behind regulators, behind officials, who ultimately are deciding whether they've got the appetite to back homegrown talent. Because at the end of the day, the product that Wayve is building and releasing, although it will be certified, it will go through a type approval process, and it will satisfy all the requirements we would want to see in a regulatory process. The government has to have the vision to want to see some of these new products brought to market and to back us, particularly at an international level, if we're going to find the ability to scale and bring this to an international market. And that, I guess, will be the difference between whether that works here in the UK or in other markets where actually there are slightly more open approaches to this. We're seeing this at a UN level in particular. So vehicle regulation is designed at the UN level. For driving assistance regulations, there's a particular feature that's being regulated for now. We know the Commission, the European Commission, Japan, Germany are all supportive of this next phase. The UK are actually one of the only countries blocking that at the moment. So clearly there is something that's not quite connected between the rhetoric of government, so this ambition, the sovereign AI unit, putting growth behind regulation, and then how officials are actually turning up and promoting UK positions in places like the UN. So I think that's where we need to see more work. But I think generally speaking, the UK has taken a very sensible approach to how it's thinking about AI risk. And it certainly will help Wayve bring a product to market.
And I think that's really interesting that, actually the government has a role to play in both supporting adoption and diffusion in the wider system, but also as Rish said, as a buyer of this technology as well. We spend sort of millions and millions of pounds to procure tech, so let's put it behind our sort of startups, etc. We only have 15 minutes left, and I'm keen that we get questions from the audience. I think there's going to be a roving mic. Brilliant. So I'll probably take a couple of questions at a time, and if you could say where you're, who you are and where you're asking from, that would be great. I'll take this lady at the front, and then this gentleman here at the front as well.
Hi, my name. Is this working? Yes. I think you can hear me.
Oh no, it's for the recording.
Okay, sorry. My name is Viviana. I'm a law student and currently qualifying as a solicitor. The question that I had for you, especially the ones that have presence both in the UK and in the US, one of the top leading AI individuals in the US, Caltech, said a number of months ago that one of the issues with the UK was that we were quite risk averse here. Also that culturally there's that sense of, which I think is a good thing, to have a life-work balance, whereas in the US people used to, or they still work quite crazy hours, and they think about the risk after they've actually implemented the solution. So I just wanted to know from your point of view if that's something that you've also seen when you work in both industries. Thank you.
Brilliant. Let's take this question out the front here, and then I'll throw it back to you guys.
Hi, my name's Bart Smallman with a company called Assembly Research. And I just wanted to ask a bit more about regulation. You just touched on it, and talking about the UK's kind of pragmatic approach and how that can be a good thing. But maybe for all of you, what kind of more specific maybe regulatory environment would you like to see that's going to encourage more venture capital investment? We keep hearing all this growth without maybe much meaning of what that is. The kind of regulation that you'd like to see that best, accommodates businesses and investment.
Well, thank you. So why don't I combine that question into, do our regulators, are our regulators too risk averse? How can we get them sort of driving growth? That's sort of question one. And then the second question is, are we very different culturally to the US, and is that a bad thing? I personally haven't met a founder who has good work-life balance, but please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know who wants to come in on that first.
I can talk about the US, UK. Part of what you said, there is a difference in the market, and yes, UK is risk reverse, and I would almost put like wider Europe in that. Let's talk about the pre-Brexit Europe. So in that mindset, the investor ecosystem is risk averse, though it's changing. I would say during my first company till now, it's been a 15-year cycle, enormous change positively. And that's why you see almost equal number of unicorns come out of Silicon Valley versus here. But if you go into the decacorn or whatever the next $100 billion number is, then the differentiation becomes big because you hardly see any of them come out of Europe. The secondly, as a buyer, because at the end of the day, every product is a business and needs to get a buyer. And the buyer has a lot more, let's get it done, optimism in US, so people are willing to pilot sooner. The path to market is faster, something that takes 6 months of discussion and then negotiation will happen in weeks in US. And people learn by trying first and then failing and then I don't like your product. Where you can spend a lot of months in intellectually discussing a value, and founders experience that across various businesses. So there's mindset between these two aspects. So, but I would say that that's why very classically we see incredible companies come out of Europe from an R&D perspective, and then US becomes a very natural next stepping point due to a bit of a monoculture market, English speaking, and a lot more appetite to spend.
Just maybe to add to that, actually, the company that comes to mind, and I'm sure everyone's familiar with this company, DeepMind, right? I mean, we all think about it as Google right now, right? But they were acquired for, I think, $400 or $500 million a while back.
Yeah.
Is it, how much was it?
$1.4 billion.
They were acquired for $1.4 billion.
Yeah.
I would argue that today they're probably worth 200 times, 300 times that amount, like within the Google business. So the UK can generate these amazing companies. There's a funding challenge at that sort of scale-up stage. But we should be proud of some of the amazing companies that have come out of the UK, and there's potential for more of those companies to come out, despite the cultural differences with the US.
That's a very good example of, so that's a non-revenue R&D exit, okay? So Google had the mindset to realize that I can have 200x value out of this asset, which then was looked at an exaggerated valuation. But the buyer needs to have some sense of vision. There was another company called Magic Pony, which was acquired for like $150 million, I think, with the valued at $15 million pre-revenue, 7-8 people, which Twitter acquired. So, and there have been quite a few, but again, you have to see in any typical bell curve, they are still the outliers, because most exits happens in businesses with some kind of established product market fit. And so you cannot build a business in mind to have a DeepMind or Magic Pony kind of an exit,
And then, Daniel, I'm going to throw the sort of regulator question at you. I mean, the Regulatory Innovation Office, for example, what would you love for them to be doing? It's currently still sat at the, it's the concept stage. So, if you had your way, what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, and just to be clear as well, like I think regulation sometimes gets a bad press, right? I think regulation done well can be a real enabler, and I think a lot of the puzzle, sort of the individual pieces of the puzzle are in place, certainly for Wayve's kind of route to market, because as I say, we're kind of, we're trying to bring a product into a highly regulated market already. It's not about necessarily even like the specific regulation. It's more about kind of that appetite and that mindset behind regulators to start thinking about and having objectives around maybe growth, rather than purely thinking about, well, what are the risks of this product and how can I prevent those risks happening, which often means that you're actually delaying and probably preventing a product coming to market. And I think actually if we were measuring some of our regulators' activities on their contribution to growth, that's actually a really different way of framing how they're also being kind of, I guess, performance managed, right? What is your contribution to the economy? So I think like changes to that mindset is key. But I also think one of the things we're playing quite a lot of kind of catch up to now is the fact that because for so long there's been products in the market in the US, for instance, that have, as we've kind of said, been brought to market very quickly. They've maybe been an afterthought in terms of, well, how do we make them safe? We're now feeling the impact of that in Europe because of the impact of some of those products. So it's also about, this isn't about saying we don't want regulation and we shouldn't have guardrails. It actually provides certainty and quite a lot of clarity for companies like Wayve. We just need to make sure that the balance between what the regulation allows and the vision for how that's going to enable this homegrown tech to actually emerge adds up, and there's a connection between central government, so number 10, the cabinet, and actual regulators on the front line. That's one of the biggest problems government always has, that connection, right? And I think one of the starting points maybe is, what are those economic outputs and those measures that you as a regulator or as an official on the front line are actually contributing to?
So having some more clear metrics. Let's take another round of questions before we wrap things up. This lady here in the corner. Anyone else? We'll just take this one here then.
Hi, I'm a AI scale-up, and I would argue the biggest issue that we have in the UK is not regulation, and I'm in financial services, quite happy with the FCA. I would say it's actually getting the money. It's quite easy to get a grant or something as a startup, I don't think I've ever met anyone who has won one of the UK Tech Awards, for example. The women in tech awards as well in particular are so small it's ridiculous, and I think they come out every 2 years. But the actual tech awards, we were turned down because there wasn't enough resonance with public good. Well, that's fair enough, because I'm wealth tech for pensions. You know, not everyone is going to be an AI solution for the NHS. So I'd be interested in your thoughts around scale-ups and funding scale-ups.
Brilliant. Who wants to take that sort of piece on, like, okay, how do we sort of move from that sort of startup piece to scale-ups and then on sort of, you know, unicorns, etc.?
Well, I think we mentioned it a little bit earlier, right? That I don't know what stage your company is, but like we're pretty well served in the earliest stages. It tends to be on the later stages when the money gets quite large sums. So like OpenOcean, each of our funds is give or take 100 million euros. But obviously when you get to the later stages and you need that 20, 30 million, maybe more, that's just not something like a fund of my size can really facilitate unless we're already involved in the business and we can, you know, do a little bit as part of the round. So I think generally what we see when our companies get to that stage is you just have to speak to the American investors a lot more. Not only them, but just a lot more. They're much more critical part of that discussion. Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to say because, you know, you can say general things, but I don't know how much you've done like the whole roadshow thing, where you go and you just do back-to-back meetings in the Valley, or New York is quite a good one, obviously, for the financial stuff. But let's not forget that getting funding is just really hard. And vast majority of companies don't get funding, and even the ones that do get funding fail. It's just a horrible industry in that, you know, the body count is pretty high. So, you know, it's difficult. I think you're right. We do have a lot of grants and things in this country, but I think people get too hung up on them. You know, it distracts you. It drags you away from your core purpose. It obviously commonly ties you in with another partner, where you have to go find a commercial partner who's probably not on your level or running at your speed. So I think actually they can do quite a lot of damage as well. And some companies live in kind of zombie mode, just like taking grants. So I think, you know, in some regard, it can be quite good to not have that. But yeah, like it's difficult. I don't really have a good answer for you, but I think the good news is there's quite a few people trying to raise growth funds or later stage funds for Europe and the UK. But right now, it's bad to raise money for a startup. It's incredibly hard to raise money for a fund right now. I think Lux Capital in the US said they expect 50 to 75% of VC funds to go out of business. Because they won't be able to raise any more funds. So we've gone through a real kind of dearth of capital, and it's still drawing back. So,
Michael, do you want to add to that positivity?
Yeah. Just trying to think. I don't always buy the story around growth capital lacking, because you have US investors who will come into the UK and happily do those growth rounds. Now, of course, it'll be great to have UK growth investors doing those rounds, but you look at, you know, Wayve, right, Synthesia, Flow Health. These are UK companies that are raising massive rounds, but it just so happens to be that the US investors come in to do those rounds. So, I mean, but I do agree with Sam. It's incredibly hard to raise money. I think less than 1% of startups actually raise venture capital funding, despite what you read in TechCrunch, and it looks like all these companies are raising money. It's a very, very small fraction. But again, you know, as I said at the beginning, I'm quite optimistic about the UK. I mean, the US last year, you know, they invested $97 billion in AI companies. In the UK, it was $16 billion. I mean, a good chunk of that came from the US. But, you know, the US is a much larger market. You know, we're a small country, and we can still get capital into these companies. It'll be great to have more UK growth investors, but that gap often gets filled by international investors.
Fantastic. And to round us off, I guess, you know, we've sort of done a little bit of a look back and where are we today, but sort of looking forward, what are you excited to see from sort of the startup scale-up ecosystem in the UK, particularly if you sort of like look at the international picture, and let's not talk about sort of the geopolitics of it all, but, you know. Sam, let me start with you. We'll quickly run down the line.
So what, just a general view
just
of
a general, we've got a minute left, so let's, you know.
Well, look, I think the good news is, and I think Rish sort of hinted at this, the whole scarcity thing can actually drive quite a lot of innovation. I think you saw the DeepSeek thing rattle a lot of people. It's definitely rattled OpenAI. I think a lot of these products in the AI space are going to become much more accessible, and that will open up a whole new realm of products that can be built with them. Paul Graham, the YC founder, did an interesting tweet just the other day saying, well, if you believe that engineering is going to become somewhat commoditized by generative AI, that is to say it can write a lot of that code for you, then really the equation just shifts massively towards who understands the customer problem. And I suspect there's way more people who understand the customer problems in various things than engineers. So I hope we'll just see a massive upswing in people who decide to build with less, faster, fewer people. Bit of a question for VCs, what we do in that equation. But yeah, I think probably what we're going through right now will spur on more companies being started.
Fantastic. How about yourself, Rish?
I feel like UK should continue to invest in its strengths, and UK's strength has always been applications. We look at ARM or DeepMind or other businesses. We are very good at use cases of technology, and the research is always about solving a problem that's in front of us. And in a way, it's good. I feel like the hype of the generative AI will normalize. Even when the first internet revolution happened, we didn't care about who built the HTTP layer or standard protocol layer or who was the browsers. Though the browsers were then the big value companies, but eventually we learned, and we figured out that actually the e-commerce or the transactional or social networks, those are all different applications. But the first generation of internet was just portals and some level of search, but like a library. And other big value companies were the browsers. And I think we are misunderstanding the same way this very revolution. And all the people who are massively valued and so-called providing the infrastructure, they're making some of the things humans already do pretty well, a little better. And I feel that in a way discredits companies like DeepMind, who are on an application level changing proteins. And there are many verticals like that in all aspects of world where big problems are being solved. And if you trace them down, there's very little PR about them, but it's coming out of UK. So I feel that what you would build on top of this layer will become a commodity, and there'll be 20 players, not 10. And my prediction is the 5 best known in the world today won't even be considered relevant 5 years from now. That level of change is coming. So there's a lot of reasons to be excited. I think the chessboard is wide open. Yeah.
Daniel.
Very quickly. So, I mean, I think I'm interested to see how this new government is still, okay, say they're new, the government now are they're established, they've set out some intent. What we want to start seeing now is kind of some action behind those words, because I think there's a real opportunity for the UK to help back some of the homegrown talent like Wayve, and actually see the commercialisation of some of what will be the very first kind of AI in the physical world products that will be a real game changer, not only to prove how you can bring these products to market safely through a full regulation process, but also unlock whole new kind of economic opportunities that just don't exist yet.
Michael, final word to you. No pressure.
No pressure. I've been reflecting on what Sam said, around sort of kind of like software engineering and how that's changing, and then also thinking about like the sort of the assets that we have in the UK, which is like science and research. But we've also got something the Americans don't have, and that is, to me, taste, culture, right? So stick with me. Think about all the exports that we have culturally in terms of music, art, film. All that stuff is going to get a lot more important as we start automating away all the mundane things and all the things that happen underground. So I'm very bullish on taste and culture in the UK.
Brilliant. So, I mean, all of you guys can now go and think of your next, your next venture. Like, we're all going to be entrepreneurs of the future. And I mean, let's forget about Hollywood. What is that again? Thank you so much to the panel. If everyone could give them a quick round of applause. And thank you for joining us this afternoon.